Good evening, I'm Nima Rajan, and this is Forum Daily for Wednesday, March 9th. Tonight, Canada steps up its support in Ukraine. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has announced Canada is sending another $50 million in military equipment to Ukraine. The latest shipment will include cameras used in drones that are manufactured by a Canadian company. During a news conference in Berlin with Germany's Chancellor, Mr. Trudeau admitted getting the equipment into Ukraine hasn't been easy, but says he believes the challenges aren't insurmountable. Mr. Trudeau and Chancellor Olaf Scholz discussed the need for an immediate ceasefire in Ukraine and energy security in Europe, which is heavily reliant on Russian oil and gas. Meanwhile, a Canadian military official says Russia's war on Ukraine is being fought on two fronts: armed conflict and disinformation. Lieutenant Colonel Yves Debian has been working in Latvia for the past 4 years and says more work needs to be done to silence the Russian propaganda machine. He says Russia's pattern for propaganda involves influencing the economy, culture, and public opinion, and it has proven effective. But Mr. Debian says this time Russia has failed to sow any discontent among NATO members. And he adds Ukraine was better prepared and informed as well. Communications giant Rogers is also weighing in on Russian influence, suggesting that Canada ban all state-owned Russian broadcasters from the air, not just RT. Rogers Communications is urging the CRTC to go further and ban all broadcasters owned or controlled by President Vladimir Putin's regime. These include RT, Channel 1 Russia, and RTR Planeta. Rogers, Bell, and other Canadian broadcasters have already removed RT from their lineups. The CRTC is conducting a speedy inquiry into whether RT should be banned from Canadian airwaves. Some big changes coming to Ontario. As of the 21st of this month, Ontario residents won't have to wear masks in most places, including schools. The province has also announced it will end all remaining COVID-19 public health measures, directives, and orders on April 27th. Individual organizations will be able to keep their own requirements in place, and most hospitals have said they will continue their strict vaccine mandates. As of today, Ontario is also loosening restrictions for close contacts of someone with COVID-19 or who is symptomatic. Well, this comes as other industries struggle to bounce back from supply chain disruptions. 9 out of 10 Canadian manufacturers surveyed say supply chain disruptions are cutting into their production and raising costs. Canadian manufacturers and exporters says that is putting the sector's recovery and the overall Canadian economy at risk. Its report says Canadian manufacturers have lost more than $10 billion in sales as a result of supply chain disruptions, and 80% have been forced to hike prices and delay filling customer orders. Well, moving to another report now, which looks at shift work in particular. A review of 18 studies finds shift work is linked to poorer working memory, slower mental processing speed, and decreased alertness and visual focus. Researchers also found shift work affects a person's ability to control impulses and situational response. This potentially increases the risk of workplace injuries and errors. The study's authors say protective measures such as naps, recovery plans, and regular monitoring should be promoted to minimize the risk of adverse health and work-related outcomes. A debilitating health condition has led the founder of athletic wear firm Lululemon Athletica to help find a cure by 2027. Chip Wilson was diagnosed at 32 with FSHD, a type of muscular dystrophy that leads to weaknesses in the face, around the shoulder blades, and upper arms. The 66-year-old is pledging $100 million to help find a cure for the rare genetic disorder. Mr. Wilson says 40% of the muscles in his body have deteriorated or turned to fat, and he expects he will not be able to walk without help in 8 years. Switching gears here to the NHL, which has signed its first Canadian sports betting partnership. It is teaming up with the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation in a multi-year partnership. Hockey fans on Proline Plus and Proline will be able to make legal single-event wagers and other unique bets. Well, staying in the world of sports, as Canada hauled in another 3 medals at the Beijing Paralympics. Brian McKeever of Canmore, Alberta, claimed his 15th gold medal with a win in the men's vision-impaired cross-country skiing sprint, while Natalie Wilkie of Salmon Arm, BC, won gold in women's sprint standing para-cross country. Bracebridge, Ontario's Colin Cameron captured bronze in the men's sprint sitting para cross-country race, And Canada has won 16 medals in Beijing, trailing only China with 31 and Ukraine with 19. Stay with us. We'll be back after the break with a look at energy prices and policy. A very interesting interview coming up next. We'll be right back on Forum Daily. Gas prices continue to rise across the country as officials respond to concerns among Canadian consumers. Nova Scotia Premier Tim Houston is expressing concerns about large gas price increases in his province, which are up about 30 cents in the last week. He says the province is looking at removing taxes placed on gasoline, which would be similar to a move announced on Monday by Alberta Premier Jason Kenney. He said he is suspending a 13-cent per liter provincial gas tax as of April 1st. Gas price hikes can also be seen in other provinces, and in some cases, prices are hitting record levels. This comes as analysts warn that further increases lie ahead, which is prompting questions about whether other provinces should consider removing their gas taxes. But one expert says that is easier said than done. Well, joining us now to give us a deeper insight into this is Mr. Constantine Pesaris, Professor of Economics at the University of New Brunswick in Fredericton. Professor, welcome to Forum Daily.
Hello, Mina. How are you?
I'm doing great, sir. Now, let's start with a brief overview of what gas taxes look like across the country.
Well, they're pretty high, and they're certainly taking a bite out of consumers' budget because the price of gasoline is going way up very quickly so that people don't have time to adjust to those new higher costs.
A lot of our viewers can relate to that, sir. Now, what do we know so far about what these gas taxes are used for on the provincial and federal level?
Well, they're used as a part of an intake in terms of meeting the expenses that governments have. And they're a consumer tax. And like the GST, provincial and the federal governments love those kind of taxes because they keep going up as people spend more money.
So how reliant are provincial and federal governments in terms of needing the revenue from these gas taxes?
I think they're very reliant on them, and particularly when people say reduce taxes so that we can afford to fill up our tanks with our cars. Governments do have expenses, and they need the additional income in order to meet those higher costs of operating the government. So it's a catch-22.
Definitely. Now, meanwhile, there are calls to scrap or suspend provincial gas taxes, just like in Alberta. But how realistic of a move is this for other provinces?
It's very realistic for Alberta because they're on the intake of higher prices of gasoline because they're the leading province for producing gasoline in Canada. Other provinces, particularly those in the Atlantic region, are going to be hard pressed to reduce or even remove those taxes because they're becoming even more dependent on them as gasoline prices increase.
All right, Professor, well, taking that into consideration, what are some realistic steps that officials can take to potentially ease the burden of these rising prices for Canadian consumers?
I think because of the tremendous impact that this is going to have on the whole population, governments have a moral responsibility to look at the marginalized and people with low incomes and provide them some direct assistance. I would prefer that this be done on a direct individual basis rather than an umbrella basis where all consumers are impacted. The vulnerable and the marginalized communities are in need of more support than people who can adjust their budgets and make through those challenging weeks and perhaps even months ahead.
All right, Professor. Well, in terms of the wider impact of these gas taxes, are we likely to see further inflation in the cost of other products and services that we buy?
Absolutely. This is an excellent question because the increase in gasoline prices impacts almost every product and service that we buy. So the ripple effect from this increase in gasoline prices is going to be felt in almost everything that we buy, from food to produce to vegetables to transportation to services to government services, and everything will be impacted by that cost.
I'm sure our Canadian consumers are not going to be happy about that, sir. Well, we are out of time for this interview, but thank you so much for giving us your time today on Forum Daily, Professor.
You're very welcome.
Stay with us. Coming up after the break, we've got more news from Canada and around the world. The head of the NATO military alliance welcomes a potential defense spending boost from Canada. We'll have more on that story and news from around the world coming up next. The head of the NATO military alliance says he welcomes Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's assertion that Canada will be looking at increasing its military spending following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg told a Canadian Defence Conference today that Canada is contributing to NATO in many different ways. That includes leading a multinational battle group in Latvia following Russia's attacks on Ukraine and committing an additional warship, aircraft, and troops to the alliance's defensive efforts in Eastern Europe. But while all NATO allies agreed in 2014 to spending 2% of their GDP on defense within the next decade, Canada has lagged behind most of its allies by consistently spending far less than that. Canada spent about 1.39% of its GDP on the military last year, according to NATO. Meanwhile, in the U.S., congressional leaders have reached a bipartisan deal to provide $13.6 billion to help Ukraine fend off its invasion by Russia. And it would also assist European allies coping with the continent's worst refugee crisis since World War II. That money and billions more to battle the pandemic are part of a compromise on an overdue $1.5 trillion measure financing federal agencies for the rest of this year. Passage of the overall bill is certain, congressional leaders hope, by week's end. Ukraine's aid has such powerful backing in Congress that the amount grew over just a few days from President Joe Biden's initial $10 billion request. All right, turning to Canada's oil industry now, which seems to have the potential for growth amid the Ukraine war. Experts say the industry has some capacity to increase exports to the United States in the wake of President Joe Biden's move to ban all Russian oil imports. Industry analysts say this country could ship between 200,000 and 400,000 additional barrels of crude per day to the U.S. using existing pipelines and rail. But they say that can't happen immediately, as it takes time to ramp up. U.S. government figures show the U.S. imported almost 700,000 barrels per day of crude oil and petroleum products from Russia in 2021. But Canada was the top exporter to the U.S. in 2021, shipping almost 3 million barrels per day of crude oil and petroleum products. Oil and gas sector advocates say significant capital investments will be required if Canada wants to significantly increase that figure in the long term. Taking a look at Canada's green energy initiatives now, as the Environment Minister says investors will soon get to buy a new government bond aimed at financing green projects, which will be selected under guidelines that experts warn could pose potential issues for would-be buyers. The Liberals want to issue $5 billion worth of green bonds and spend proceeds within 2 fiscal years of the money coming in. Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault says the government is targeting an inaugural issuance in the coming weeks. In a speech today to the Canadian Club Toronto, Mr. Guilbeault calls the bonds a crucial part of the government's strategy to mobilize the necessary investment toward creating a sustainable economy. However, experts say the government will need to apply a high set of standards about where money goes to avoid investors questioning the credibility of the green label on the bond. Canada is being asked to help fight hunger in the developing world, as the UN World Food Programme is warning that millions of people are on the brink of starvation. This is following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which is one of the world's biggest exporters of grain. It is asking Canada and other major wheat exporters to open up their silos to urgently fill the shortage of wheat, which it warns could lead to millions going hungry in countries including Afghanistan, Yemen, and Sudan. On Friday, Canada's Agriculture Minister, Marie-Claude Bibeau, will attend an emergency meeting of G7 agriculture ministers to discuss the impact of the Russian invasion on global food security. To the East Coast, the BC government is being urged to move quickly to develop a policy to distribute a safer supply of drugs. A review panel that investigated more than 6,000 overdose deaths wants the government to work with the BC Centre for Disease Control and the BC Centre on Substance Use and create a policy by May 9th. It wants the Ministry of Mental Health and Addictions, the Health Ministry, and health authorities to rapidly expand access to a safer supply of drugs, including in rural and Indigenous communities. All right, turning to a new study by British researchers, which indicates that stable employment and housing are both critical to support when treating adults with depression. Researchers from the University College London analyzed 9 studies, including data from more than 4,800 adults receiving primary care depression treatment. They found the depression prognosis after 1 year was worse in patients who are unemployed compared with employed patients, and worse in non-homeowners compared with homeowners. Stay with us. We'll be right back with news from around the world only on Forum Daily News, so stay tuned. We'll be back shortly. A Russian attack has severely damaged a children's hospital and maternity ward in the besieged port city of Mariupol, according to Ukrainian officials. Citizens are also trying to escape shelling on the outskirts of Kyiv, streaming toward the capital amid warnings from the West that Moscow's invasion is about to take a more brutal and indiscriminate turn. Ukrainian officials are saying that at least 17 people were hurt in the hospital attack. Moving to Australia, where the Prime Minister says he will declare a national emergency. This is following floods across large swaths of the East Coast that have claimed 22 lives. Prime Minister Scott Morrison made the announcement today during a visit to flood-devastated Leesmore in northern New South Wales state. The national emergency declaration will allow officials to cut through red tape in delivering services and support. Historic moves being made in the Middle East. Israeli President Isaac Herzog has arrived in Turkey, becoming the first leader from Israel to visit in 14 years. Mr. Herzog is to hold talks with Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in Ankara on Wednesday. This is before traveling to Istanbul for meetings with members of Turkey's Jewish community. Israel and Turkey were once close allies, but the relationship had frayed under Mr. Erdogan, who is an outspoken critic of Israel's policies toward the Palestinians. The steps toward a rapprochement comes as economically troubled Turkey tries to end its international isolation by normalizing ties with several Mid-East countries. Turkey has said there would be no change to Ankara's position toward the Palestinians. To the east, South Korea has elected its next president. A conservative former prosecutor declared victory in South Korea's presidential election on Thursday local time. This after his liberal ruling party rival conceded defeat amid a bitter and fierce battle in the politically divided nation. People Power Party candidate Yoon Suk-yeol won 48.59% of the votes, with around 98% of the ballots counted as of 4 a.m. Liberal rival Lee Jae-myung received 47.8% of the votes. The president-elect thanked his supporters outside of his home in the capital city of Seoul after what he described as a long night. All right, well, in the U.S., opening statements began this morning in the jury trial of 4 men who prosecutors say plotted to kidnap Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer. Prosecutors have said the men were angry about pandemic restrictions that the Democratic governor imposed in early 2020. Defense attorneys say the men deny any conspiracy to kidnap Ms. Whitmer. They have signaled an entrapment defense, criticizing the government's use of undercover FBI agents. The federal trial in Grand Rapids could last more than a month. Staying in the U.S., where the president is making moves in the cryptocurrency market and has signed an executive order on government oversight of cryptocurrency. It urges the Federal Reserve to explore whether the central bank should create its own digital currency. The executive order had been widely anticipated by the finance industry and others who have compared the cryptocurrency market with the Wild West. The order comes amid growing concern that Russia may be using cryptocurrency to avoid the impact of financial sanctions imposed by Western allies in response to the invasion of Ukraine. Turning to France now, where the Kyiv City Ballet danced to a full house in Paris yesterday. This was for the last show of a French tour that has left the company stranded since the war broke out in Ukraine 2 weeks ago. They described being physically and emotionally exhausted. Being given the opportunity to train and dance was for many a chance to focus on something other than the war. The young dancers will now have residency at the Théâtre du Châtelet in the French capital until they can go home. One of the troupe is heading from Paris to Ukraine's border with Poland to retrieve her daughter. We end the cast with an exciting discovery of a polar explorer that sank in November 1915. An expedition has found the sunken wreck of Ernest Shackleton's ship Endurance, which was crushed by ice in Antarctica. The Falklands Maritime Heritage Trust says the ship lies 3,000 meters below the surface of the Weddell Sea, which is about 6.4 kilometers south of the location recorded in 1915 by its captain, Frank Worsley. The team says the ship is upright, intact, and in a brilliant state of preservation. Historian and broadcaster Dan Snow says the wreck has been filmed, but won't be touched. All right, I'm Nima Rajan, and that'll do it for your look at national and international news for today. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and make sure to follow our social media handles on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You can also watch all of our commentary, programming, and interviews on the News Forum YouTube channel. Take care, Canada. We'll see you next time on Forum Daily News.